Hi, everyone. I'm here today to talk a little bit about module federation in a React application leveraging TypeScript. So, one of the key reasons that I chose module federation for this particular demo is to talk a little bit about micro front ends and the process, a little bit about mono-repos and another ecosystem managed by NX. So NX is a monorepo tool. There's many tools out there available. You can use Lerna, Yarn workspaces. There are other options, but I really want to try to cover at its core module federation for React with TypeScript, and I'll kind of talk about how these things all fit together. So micro front ends, basically a concept of developing a web application, or maybe not even a application specifically, could even be a package, some sort of functionality that's its own kind of discrete deployable that an application can load at runtime and leverage and basically have a seamless um, experience. So the idea is probably maybe well illustrated if you think about maybe a popular e-commerce type app that you're used to working with or using, I should say, Target, Walmart, Amazon, any of these applications. And if you think about what your user experience is when you browse to them, you might have a home page with different products or product highlights, sales that they're advertising. You might have kind of a products page where you're able to see different products, maybe by category. So you're kind of browsing through that catalog, if you will. And then there could be something like a cart or some sort of checkout. Now, for some of these big applications, there's probably a fair amount of work that goes into not just developing them, but pushing updates, maintaining those pages, developing them over time, and releasing one big web application, especially for one of those sites I just mentioned, is probably not an easy task. So how would you manage pushing, let's say, just the products page or a update to some cart or payment type functionality, or maybe some kind of redesign to the homepage, right, that just provides a different user experience? Well, I mentioned mono-repos before, and that could definitely be a part of it, although it doesn't have to. But it makes you wonder, are they hosted separately, and then you have a routing mechanism that sits over top of it? You're probably not releasing the whole, .com type website at one time. So I think micro front ends here is a really good example, and I think something you can kind of relate to with those products. So in a micro front end, it's a kind of discrete part of an application, if you think about it in, let's say, simple terms, that lives out on maybe a CDN or some type of hosting mechanism that can be remote loaded when the user requests it um, on your website, right? So this could be just going to the homepage of your website. It could be clicking on a link. There's different ways you could kind of remote load that bundle out there. And to be clear as well, module federation is not limited to JavaScript, although that's definitely the use case here and what I plan to demo. So let's talk a little bit about the mono-repo real quick. So the mono-repo here is basically, I'm using it to kind of demonstrate the ability to use TypeScript. There are other libraries that I'll link in the video here that you can use to remote load types. So what I mean by that is if you picture an application and let's say you're, importing something into your file, you might need to have, that type declarations available to you, right, in order to actually use and compile your code. So one of the things here with NX that I chose for this video is the fact that NX to me seems like a very mature option with lots of bells and whistles. So there's a lot of potential with NX. It's got a CLI type interface. You can essentially build different types of applications. So it's not limited to React. You can use Angular, Vue. There's a lot of different support. It's got lots of different plugins, packages, tons of different features. It's a great product. I definitely recommend checking it out. So the demo application here is a simple React app, and I'll go ahead and start it here. So the demo application here is basically a NX workspace. So it's a Mono-Repo, and really at the core of it, you're going to have apps and libs or libraries. For this particular demo, I chose to do everything under apps. You can use libs probably in a very similar fashion to this. I just chose not to for this particular video. One of the nice things too, about NX is I've scaffolded most of this using their CLI. So this is their VS Code plugin. So I've basically generated these, and right out of the box with this current version of NX, which I think is like 13.2. You're getting a React application with TypeScript and, of course, other NX centric things. So I'll talk a little bit about how we've peeled those back to get module federation working for React. The one thing I will note here is that if you're using Angular, module federation for NX is a little bit easier. There's some additional packages and things you can import where that functionality works without peeling some of NX back. But one of the things I really enjoyed about MX is the ability to peel those back, right? You're not totally closed within their ecosystem. You can customize it. So we'll walk through some of that. So as I expand the apps folder here, what you can kind of see is three parts of an application. I have a shell app, a home, and an about me page. And this application is relatively simple. It's just kind of here to illustrate how that module federation works, walking through the parts, and then what I had to do to get it working with NX. So let me go ahead and run the application. So right now with this command, it's running three different Webpack dev servers. So I have one on 4200, which is my shell application. But what's interesting is it's remote loading in the home and the about me web application. So because home is basically the base URL. So here's the application running. And if I go over to the network tab, what I'll see here is essentially the dependencies and the applications loading in. So one interesting note here is the remote entry files. So this basically is a module map for all of the dependencies running on the different ports. You have 4200, which is the shell app, 4100, which is the about me app, and then 4202, which is the home app. So you'll notice here that the home application will show up, the home component will show up loaded here, and will be loading off of 4202. And you can also see when I click About Me that the About Me component will load. And it'll also load its other various dependencies too. So if I have a couple of dependencies that aren't mapped out into my module federation shared section, those will load. These aren't being shared in this particular case. The About Me module will load as well, and you'll see that these are on different ports. And it'll even load the particular theme provider that About Me consumes as well. This actually comes from 4200. So what's interesting is if I went to 4202 directly, I'm now browsing the standalone home application, still leveraging the shell application. So in this case, I'm actually remote loading shell. So it's kind of a circular dependency here. It's meant to just illustrate a way you could hook it up. So in this case, I'm sharing my React router and that routing configuration. So if I go to 4201, this is the About Me app, and you can see that the text changes here. So in this case, it's actually remote loading two different components. It's remote loading home, and it's remote loading shell. So these two are standalone applications that you can browse, and they look the exact same as the shell application. So one of the interesting things here with module federation is that I'm basically configuring the components that are remote. So if I go back to the code here, what I'll do is I'll just browse through the shell app real quick. So in the shell application here, you can find this in the module federation documentation, which I'll link in the video as well. So they recommend this kind of boundary between your application and your import statement. So the boundary here is this bootstrap file. And essentially, this is where you are bootstrapping React in. It's just in this separate file. So module federation has a very clean place that is effectively a single import that it can use as a boundary to your application. So in this particular case, my bootstrap file is just importing app, and this is under the shell again. And then I have a component called shell, and it is essentially a React router setup with a couple of different paths. These components that it's loading are all coming from React Lazy, and it has a simple prompt of React children. So it's rendering these DOM elements from within this component. So the shell provides a couple of different things. One, it provides this nav bar. So this is another component here that's part of the shell application. So the nav bar here in this case is just that top banner, and it's got links to the other sites, right? So you have a link to home, a link to about me. These are all configured within the shell component. So it's a fairly typical React router setup. You'll notice that I'm wrapping the route configuration in suspense since they are loaded through React Lazy. I don't have an error boundary set up for this, but it's something you probably should do. So if there is an issue, lazy loading, it will catch that. So kind of wrapping all of this is this thing called a theme provider. So I'll go back to this here in a minute. This is effectively the shell component. So at this point, it's pretty typical React, right? So there's an index HTML file. There's nothing really special about it. I have a Webpack configuration, a tsconfig. Let's take a look at the Webpack config real quick. This is kind of the core of the module federation setup. So a lot of this is pretty typical for a React application, right? So there's a Babel file here that's configured Jest. Nothing kind of out of the ordinary. One thing I will point out, though, in this file is that under plugins, I am using the Module Federation plugin, which comes with Webpack 5. So this is pretty much the core of the Module Federation implementation. I have to give my application a name. So this is if you think about this being an application, the application's name, if you will. There's information here that just tells it a little bit about its dependencies, what it's exposing. So file name is basically the metadata of the module map. So when you go back to this particular application here, if I type in remote entry, this is basically a map of all the modules within my application. So this is React modules that I'm exporting. This is effectively the kind of the import map. So this gives module federation a way to take a name and associate it with some type of URL, and then determine how to load a module within that particular set of modules, right? Chunks, if you will. So right now in the shell application, I'm exposing two different items here. One is a component called shell, which is that kind of React router configuration. The other one is a provider. So this is using React context. This is the theme provider, and I'll go back to this in a minute. But I'm basically saying that, hey, if you reference my shell app /shell or /theme, these are the two that I'm exposing. So this is all built into that module map. I can also specify remotes that I depend on. So in this case, I do specify myself. And that's mainly because my shell application is using React context and things like that. But the home and the About Me app are also specified here. So remotes is very interesting. It doesn't mean that I'm loading, so just because shell app is here and I'm within the shell app, doesn't mean that I'm remote loading myself. It would be on the same domain. So there's a lot of different very interesting use cases for remotes where you can even kind of overload remote loaded functionality with your own. It's not in context for this video, but it is something to note. And then we have shared modules here. So the interesting thing about the shared portion of the module configuration is basically I can give context to Webpack about different libraries that I would like to reference. And in terms of referencing, I can put on a particular version. So there could be a required version. I can specify if they're singleton. And I can also specify if I need to eagerly load them as well. So this will help kind of manage, big libraries like React or React DOM, where those libraries might need to be available before I can load my module. So there's some configuration in here, but otherwise, this is basically the module federation set up for Shell app. Now, what's interesting here, again, is that I'm exposing these two. So if I go to the About Me app and I open its Webpack config, About Me is also given a name, and it also exposes components. In this case, it exposes this About Me component. And it also specifies a remote dependency of Shell app as well. So its dependency here is Shell app, but it exposes the About Me as well. And it has a similar set of shared dependencies. Where the dependency object comes from too is just basically importing the package JSON. Because it is a mono-repo, there's essentially one main package JSON. So they're all just referencing that same file right now. But this is setting up module federation. So let's talk a little bit about TypeScript. So at this point, you have a shell application that's exported and consumed by About Me. So when I go into the About Me app in here, you'll see that it has the same kind of boundary set up as the shell application, where you have this bootstrap concept and it's loading its own app file. And what you'll notice here is a couple of things. One, its app file is referencing shell. So in this case, shell is loaded through React Lazy. An interesting fact here with module federation is you don't have to use React Lazy to load the components. You can, but you don't have to. So I'll show an example of that as well. In this case, app is importing shell, and I'll talk about the TypeScript component of this. But the About Me component is nested under the shell component, and that's effectively what we see on the main page, is we have this About Me, and when I go back to my app and I go to the About Me route, you'll see About Me load, and this is still coming from the shell app, just to kind of show what's all involved here, how these moving pieces work. So what's interesting about the import statement here is because we are using TypeScript, we have to give context into what the import statement resolves to. So in this particular case, I don't want my application to bundle with another application. So, you could create a shell app here as a NPM package. The problem with that will be that you'll import it and you'll get type declarations and typing from that package. But you're bundling that application with your application, which means that when they have to update, you've got to update the package, re-release your application. Now, because shell is a micro-frontend in this case, or a federated module, I can remote load that federated module right over the web. So as that changes, I'm not bound to the life cycles and the versioning of their packages, right? They're independently developing. I'm remotely consuming their dependency, and I can apply different ways of versioning that dependency as well if I wanted to or needed to. So at this point, how do you resolve this, right? So this is kind of one of the tricky parts with module federation and TypeScript. So let me go ahead and just kind of close up this directory here. So when you look at these three applications, they all have their own tsconfig. And we also have a base TS config in here as well. So what I'll say at this point is where I started deviating away from NX. So with NX, things mostly just work fine out of the box. There's no reason to touch it. But with module federation, I had to make some changes. So two of the big changes you have to make in order for TypeScript references to work without directly bundling your code is there's two features in TypeScript. One is the paths feature. The other one is references. So what I'll do here is I'll go into the shell app, I'll open its TS config, and we'll talk about that first. So all of the TS configs at the app level all extend from the base TS config. They all have references. So this is a newer feature in TypeScript, but it essentially lets you reference another directory, and it'll look for its TS config file. You can also specify it, but it will pull in type declarations from that particular project. So in the TS config, in my base config, is where I kind of define all of my different aliases. So in this particular case, they're maybe a little bit more rigid for shell app. The idea is that you can define these either specifically or you can kind of wildcard things. It depends on how you're developing those, different modules and what you're exposing or maybe importing, into those modules, right? So this is effectively how the types are set up. You have a combination of paths and a combination of references. So with both of these together, you're able to keep your TS configs relatively simple, right? So you're just extending off of a base. You're providing a reference into another application, and then you're defining aliases, for the different components that you're exposing. In this case, they're very specific, but you can see I'm using wildcards here for these. So at this point, my TypeScript config, lends itself really well to the Mono-Repo, right? Because you're not dealing with remote types. There are packages out there. Once again, I'll put them into the video description, but you can remote load. You could develop something like that, but the Mono-Repo is what I'm demonstrating here. So let's talk a little bit about kind of extending this further. So in my shell application, I've got this provider. So let me open the shell component again. So I've got this theme provider here. And my theme provider is actually pretty straightforward. It's essentially React context, and it's gathering its context from session storage. So dive into that for a second. I want to share data between my shell application and one of my consuming applications, Micro-Frontends. Well, the ways to do that are not generally straightforward, right? So I would say if you needed to share something like a Redux or some kind of store, you might want to kind of think about how some of that is architected. It's probably out of scope for this video. One of the main ideas here, though, is a simple demonstration of context sharing some piece of data. And I'm using session storage as kind of the backing plane for that, if you will. So essentially, you have this theme provider, which is React context. It's basically providing two things. One of it's a simple string enum of a light or a dark mode, and then you have this change theme, which basically puts the data in session store and then sets some local state. So if I go into the application and I click change theme, it just toggles the colors on the nav bar here. And this is within the shell application. So if I refresh, and you can see this still happens within the About Me application. So at this point, I've remote loaded in a different micro front end, but this functionality stays the same. Now, what's interesting though, if I go to About Me directly and I click it, it'll still work. So it's still getting that component, and it's still centralizing that functionality because it's all coming from your shell component directly. So if I went into let's say the console here, and I wanted to maybe log out, how that was working. So in the about me, what I'm going to do is basically uncomment this here. So what this is doing is it's effectively importing my hook, my use theme context hook that I'm exposing from my shell application's theme component. Okay. So this particular hook here is just imported without React Lazy. It's referenced here within the component, and then I'm just logging out that theme value. The linting error you see here is actually from NX, and it's basically saying that I have a circular dependency between the apps, right? So it makes sense because About Me is importing the shell application, and the shell application references About Me. So I'll just ignore this for now. This is just an artifact of me, hooking things up under apps and not using libs. I'm going to go ahead and uncomment that. This is another example of importing without React Lazy, but still using a remote module. So when I refresh the page here, you'll see it'll say dark. So this is actually coming from that About Me component. Now, what's interesting here is I can click this, but then there's no re-render and nothing is being logged out here. And that's because what's actually happening is the shell application is receiving this and effectively managing that change, and it doesn't cascade down into my micro front end, right? So it's not full on React context, propagating all of that stuff down. So it's interesting to note here that the goal of this video is not to provide a comprehensive Redux or context implementation with module federation. So I just wanted to point out where this is at in the video. So if I toggle this to light, but I refresh it, you'll see it'll say light on the refresh because it's backed by session storage. So hopefully that makes sense. So inside NX, other interesting things that I've had to do to kind of get this to work is you'll notice that NX creates these project JSON files. And in project JSON, there's a couple of different ways that you can peel back the NX layer and get some of these to work. So one is providing a custom Webpack config. So by default, NX does this for you, but because we want module federation, and there is not a React module federation plugin for NX like there is for Angular, you have to specify your own Webpack config. It's very simple. It's just changing the directory that this is pointing to. Now, an additional change is under the serve portion of NX, right? So NX has a command out of the box called serve, and serve is effectively what's running their Webpack config. So this looks a little different out of the box, but the main change here is that instead of letting it run its NX configuration, so this looks slightly different as I mentioned, you can just say, hey, I want to run commands. So this is just another part of this workspace package. And then you can give it just regular npm commands. So in this particular case, this is the shell app, but it's running all three of the other projects. And when I serve the shell app, it's serving those other projects. So this is just running three commands. This serve command lives in each package JSON under each project directory. So in this case, it's just running serve, and that's just running Webpack CLI serve. And really, that's all there is to it. So the modifications to NX are pretty minimal. It gives you plenty of flexibility there. I do have some examples as well of some of the tests for this. So if you look at shell as an example, so how are you kind of mocking some of these things out, right? So if I wanted to run unit tests for shell, I have some examples there of being able to kind of mock out just some of those remote dependencies and effectively being able to test your application with that mocking in place. So some of those tests are there. The end-to-end tests with Cypress that come from NX, I haven't run these yet, but it is something that, as you can imagine, would probably work fine because you're just remote serving those bundles. Other things in the future to consider here is that in the actual Webpack config, these URLs probably are going to change. There is a package for that. There's an external like package URL plugin for Webpack you can use. There's a couple different ways you can manage this. You could abstract this out to a JSON file and import it here. Once again, out of context for the video. So hopefully this kind of helped walk through a implementation of React with TypeScript in a Mono-Repo, and talk about what kind of that TypeScript journey is. A lot of the videos I've seen out there, or websites, are creating the type declarations by hand, or there's so many different ways that I've seen it set up, but I've never seen one that just references along with the path aliases to just get a full working demo without manually creating or maintaining any files. That's effectively how they're set up. The TypeScript references and paths here are very good. One thing I will say though is if you're making a lot of changes to TS configs, Webpack, and you're just kind of all over the place, and you're still having issues with it resolving, in the command palette here, you can come in, you can restart the TypeScript server if you're in VS Code. Definitely helpful. Sometimes it does get a little out of sync and it has a hard time recovering, so you don't have to restart your editor to fix those problems. Anyways, I'll have links to the repository in the video description as well. So the repo is basically just everything we went over here. It has some more information about NX. The NX site is nx.dev. Definitely recommend you checking it out. It's a great tool for monorepos. There's a little bit of a learning curve, so I would probably say that just be aware of what you're getting into with NX. Do some testing, some experimentation before committing to something. And I hope this React Module Federation demo was helpful. Thanks.